London nearly stopped existing in less than a week, and it began with one fire in one bakery after midnight. By the time the flames were checked, whole streets, churches, markets, and the old heart of the city had been erased. For 4 days in September 1666, London did not just burn, it came close to losing the shape of its whole life. To feel how close that was, you have to picture the city before the first spark turned into disaster. The old city of London still looked and worked like a medieval city, packed tight and built for danger. Many houses were made of timber, and some were coated with pitch that could help fire bite harder and spread faster. Upper floors often pushed out over the lanes, so buildings leaned towards each other across streets already far too narrow. Workshops and warehouses sat among homes, and they were filled with rope, hay, straw, oil, tallow, coal, and other fuel. This was not a city with clean gaps between living, trade, and storage because everything crowded into the same space. The summer before the fire had also been long and dry, which left wood, roofs, and timber frames easier to ignite. London had no modern fire brigade waiting with engines, hoses, radios, and trained crews ready to move at once. People fought fire with leather buckets, hand squirts, hooks, and the brutal idea of pulling buildings down for fire breaks. That last method mattered most when a blaze grew large, because a gap in buildings could stop flames finding fresh fuel. But demolition had to happen early, and early decisions were exactly where London lost its best chance of control. The fire began after midnight on Sunday, the 2nd of September 1666, on Pudding Lane near the riverfront. The building was the bakery of Thomas Fariner, also written Fariner, and sometime after the ovens were shut, the house caught fire. Fariner and his family escaped through an upstairs window as the flames spread through the building around them. One maid reportedly did not get out, a small human detail at the edge of a city-sized catastrophe. A local fire in a bakery should not have erased a capital, yet 2 ingredients turned this one into a monster. The first was a strong easterly wind that pushed sparks and heat straight into the crowded streets beyond the bakery. The second was delay, because the quickest serious answer would have been to pull down houses ahead of the flames. Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth hesitated over that choice, and those lost moments mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Once the fire gained strength, ordinary tools and ordinary courage were no longer enough to hold it in place. On that Sunday, the flames were driven westward through the Riverside district, feeding from house to house with terrifying ease. The lanes were tight, the buildings were dry, and every roof and wall seemed ready to hand the blaze onward. Samuel Pepys, whose diary became one of the great eyewitness records, quickly realized this was far beyond a neighborhood fire. As Sunday wore on, people began doing what people always do when a city starts to fail around them. They tried to save what they could carry, loading carts, wheelbarrows, backs, and boats with whatever might still be rescued. Roads clogged with furniture, goods, tools, bedding, animals, and frightened families all trying to move at once. The River Thames became both escape route and moving storehouse, crowded with boats stacked with household possessions. What burned on Sunday was not only timber and roofing, but time, because the city was losing control hour by hour. By the end of that first day, a bakery fire had become an urban catastrophe driven by wind and hesitation. Then came Monday, the 3rd of September, the day London understood the city itself might actually be lost. The fire spread west and north with a force that eyewitnesses remembered not only as heat, but as noise. People heard timber cracking, walls collapsing, bells ringing, crowds shouting, carts grinding, and the long roar of a firestorm. That roar mattered because huge fires can draw in their own air, making the blaze even harder to stop. Panic deepened as more people tried to flee with property, and every crowded route became slower and more desperate. The Thames stayed full of boats and barges, while the roads jammed under the weight of goods and fear. Monday also brought a new kind of destruction, because major commercial districts began to burn in real time. Warehouses on Thames Street caught fire, and what they held made the blaze far worse than burning homes alone. Stores of oil, wine, spirits, and coal fed the fire with extra power, turning trade goods into fresh weapons. This was the moment London was not only losing shelter, but losing the machinery that kept its economy alive. The Royal Exchange, one of the symbols of the city's commercial life, was threatened and then lost. Other mercantile buildings were swallowed as well, and that meant money, records, trade, and confidence were all going up in flames. A burning house is a tragedy, but a burning commercial core can make a whole city stop functioning. King Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, became directly involved in organizing firefighting and demolition. That royal presence mattered because fear was spreading faster than news, and a city in panic can also slide into unrest. Still, even with the king's help, Monday was a day of loss more than control. The fire had grown too large for simple bravery, and the old city kept handing it fresh rows of fuel. By Tuesday, the 4th of September, the disaster reached its emotional and symbolic peak at Old St. Paul's Cathedral. Many people had believed the great stone cathedral would survive, even if everything around it burned down. That belief seemed so strong that some people even stored goods there, trusting its size and stone to protect them. But St. Paul's was surrounded by wooden scaffolding because restoration work was underway at the time. Nearby printers had also stored books and paper, adding still more fuel to a place people thought was safe. When the fire reached the cathedral, that faith collapsed with the building itself. Witnesses described heat so intense that the lead roof reportedly melted and ran down the streets. Stone cracked or burst in the fire, shattering the idea that anything in the city was too strong to burn. The loss of St. Paul's was more than architectural damage, because it broke the city's spirit in plain sight. If even the cathedral could fall, then almost nothing in old London felt secure any longer. Tuesday was also the day fear spread beyond the old commercial center towards other important parts of the capital. The flames threatened Fleet Street, the Temple, and the direction of Whitehall, raising fear that the royal court might be next. The glow over London could be seen for miles, turning the sky itself into a warning. People outside the city could see disaster before they heard its details, because the fire had become a landmark. As buildings vanished, social tension rose as well, and panic began looking for human enemies. England was at war with the Dutch and the French, and old anti-foreigner suspicion rose quickly in the chaos. Rumors of arson spread through frightened crowds, and foreigners were harassed or attacked by people desperate for someone to blame. This dark pattern appears in many disasters, and London followed it with brutal speed. A Frenchman named Robert Hubert later confessed to starting the fire, but the evidence points strongly to innocence. He was executed anyway, even though he may not even have been in the right place to do what he claimed. That false confession shows how a city in terror can punish a story before it proves the truth. By the end of Tuesday, London had watched St. Paul's burn and seen suspicion spread alongside the flames. Then came Wednesday, the 5th of September, the day the city's luck finally changed a little. The single most important natural change was the wind, because it began to drop after days of driving the fire onward. With less wind, fire breaks had a better chance of working, and men could finally interrupt the spread. Demolition became more effective, including the use of gunpowder to tear down buildings ahead of the flames. This was violent, costly work, but by then destruction in one place was the price of saving another. The fire did not vanish in a single hour, and hot ruins stayed dangerous after the main advance slowed. Some sources treat the 6th of September as the point when the fire was fully out. But the 5th is the true turning point, because that was when London stopped losing the battle. The city still stood, but the medieval city people had known was effectively gone. The scale of destruction was staggering even by modern standards, and almost beyond belief in 1666. About 13,200 houses were destroyed across roughly 436 acres of the city. 87 parish churches were lost, along with St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, and Guildhall. Around 70,000 people were left homeless out of a city population of about 80,000. That means most of the people who lived in the old city suddenly had no proper home there at all. Yet the official death toll is one of the strangest parts of the whole story. For years, figures of only a few deaths, sometimes 6 or fewer than 10, were widely repeated. Many historians doubt that tiny number, and for good reason. Poor victims were less likely to be recorded, intense fires can leave little trace, and later deaths may never be counted. Smoke, burns, shock, injury, and exposure after the fire could all take lives beyond the official list. So the true death toll may never be known, but the neat low number almost certainly misses part of the truth. After the flames were checked, another crisis began, because tens of thousands of people still had to live somewhere. Refugees camped in fields and makeshift shelters, surrounded by uncertainty, loss, and the approach of colder weather. Property disputes also exploded, because when streets and landmarks vanish, proving who owns what becomes painfully hard. The city had to rebuild while trade, law, and daily life were all damaged at once. Big redesign plans were drawn up, including famous ideas from Christopher Wren for a more orderly London. Some plans imagined broader streets and a cleaner layout, shaped by the lessons of the disaster. But rebuilding a living city is harder than drawing a perfect one on paper. Land ownership, business needs, and the pressure to rebuild quickly forced compromise at almost every step. Even so, the rebuilt city did change in ways that lasted. New rules pushed building towards more brick and stone instead of the same timber pattern that had burned so easily. Street planning improved in some places, and later systems of fire insurance began to grow from this memory of loss. More organized firefighting also developed in the years that followed, shaped by what London had learned the hard way. The Great Fire also sits in a grim sequence, because it came just after the Great Plague of 1665. To Londoners, it could feel as if disease and flame had arrived one after the other to break the city. That is why this story still matters more than a simple schoolbook tale about a bakery and some flames. In less than a week, London suffered a collapse of housing, trade, religion, trust, and basic city life all at once. A bakery on Pudding Lane started it, wind and delay fed it, and St. Paul's burning told everyone how bad it had become. Then falling wind, harder demolition, and sheer effort stopped the spread before London disappeared completely. The city survived, but medieval London did not, and that is the real ending of those September days. The old city had also just lived through the Great Plague of 1665, so many Londoners were already exhausted, frightened, and primed to see disaster everywhere. Fire in a crowded timber city is dangerous in normal times, but fire after plague hits a population with weaker trust and less resilience. Each delay on Sunday mattered, because once the wind threw embers ahead, one fire became many fires at once. The Thames helped people escape, but it also showed the scale of panic as boats turned into floating storehouses for whole households. When warehouses full of oil, wine, spirits, and coal burned, the blaze was no longer feeding only on houses and shops. It was feeding on the very supplies that kept London rich, connected, and alive as a trading city. St. Paul's mattered so much because many people thought stone alone could stop the disaster, and the cathedral destroyed that belief in one day. The tiny official death count fits a pattern seen in many old disasters where poor victims, later deaths, and missing bodies vanish from the record. Rebuilding changed materials, street planning, and later fire insurance because the city had learned, at enormous cost, what timber density and weak firefighting can do. The Great Fire was not simply a blaze to remember. It was a systems failure that rewrote how London thought about building and survival. If you want another true history story where just a few days changed everything people thought was safe, watch my next history video.